Okay, just one sec. Okay, we're recording. Over to you, Mrs. Kirby. Thank you.
Okay, can you see the PowerPoint? I'm just checking.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So hello everyone. A couple of years ago, I wrote an article for Portsmouth Point about rape storylines on screen, specifically Downton Abbey and Poldark at the time. And today I want to revisit the examples, but place them in a wider context of rape narratives on screen. Narratives about rape aren't new on our TVs or on film, but I don't think they've ever been quite as conspicuous as they are at the moment. Of course, the dialogue surrounding rape culture is something we're all very much aware of, and it's become more urgent. And this conversation, I think, has been rendered even louder than ever in the wake of the #MeToo movement and other singular cases such as Sarah Everard that have been, catapulted onto a political platform. So for me these days, when I watch rape storylines on screen, I think I do so more carefully, more warily, maybe more aware at least of how I think they play their part in this narrative that we're all having. So I'm going to start by looking at Keira Knightley here. So she said back in 2018, sorry, one sec, sorry, what did she say? She said, I don't really do films set in the modern day because the female characters almost always end up getting raped. And I think Knightley's comments highlight something about the Western entertainment industry's attitude towards sexual violence against women, because it is so highly visible, conspicuously so. And I think that that's particularly topical in this kind of post-Harvey Weinstein world. But what I want to consider is whether or not this is actually a problematic thing or not. So is Knightley right in the sense that female storylines end up being tied up with sexual violence in a reductive sense? Or alternatively, are writers and directors, by writing these stories, doing their bits to sort of respond to a political climate that quite rightly demands we have these conversations about rape culture? Well, art responding to such issues isn't new, and it's not the first time that popular culture has responded to what we now term as rape culture. In fact, if we journey back to the 1970s, we see examples, especially in America, where the small screen did its best to engage with rape culture. Despite their lack of Hollywood credentials, made-for-TV movies were a huge hit with domestic audiences in the 1970s, and this coincided with the second-wave feminist movement. As such, tackling people's perceptions of rape was high on the agenda of various institutions and charities. One such film was called A Case of Rape, which came out in 1974, starring Elizabeth Montgomery, who you might recognise from the Bewitched TV series. In the film, Ellen is a middle-class housewife and she is brutally raped. She's attending evening classes and accepts a ride home with another man, and is assaulted. When she goes to the police, they are very aggressive towards her, so she doesn't end up reporting it. It's only when she's raped for a second time by the same man that she does. This heralds the beginning of a set of really painful and personal legal battles. She's interrogated the police, who actually ask her whether or not she found the force the man used exciting. Her husband also suspects her of complicity in the act and blames her for their flailing kind of sex life. Given its sustained focus on the kind of judicial elements of a rape case, there's a kind of startling conclusion because her killer is found not guilty. Equally, the opening credits of the film recite statistics on rape, and the epilogue adds a kind of similarly pseudo-factual air, which reports that Ellen's rapist was caught fleeing the scene of another assault shortly afterwards. So the message of the film does seem quite clear and maybe quite progressive. It suggests the law isn't adequate and that reform is needed. And by presenting stories of women whose lives have been shattered by sexual assault and of rapists escaping justice, the TV movie aimed to kind of expose the realities faced by rape victims, as well as the challenges faced by legal and social reformers. However, despite the best of intentions, such as attempts at dispelling rape myths actually can perpetuate just as many. So in the film, it's actually the impact of those around her more than Ellen that's really formed the crux of the film. Similarly, we also in the film see a woman who's punished for her independence and friendliness with other men. And because the script and direction of the actual TV movie kind of sideline her, arguably the victim's experience and the victim's perspective on events is lacking. Written and directed by men, arguably the execution of the storyline undercuts some of the important messages it aims to communicate by essentially marginalising the female victim. And herein lies one of, I think, the main issues with rape narratives. Historically, in particular, they often reduce their female leads to mere plot devices. And in the 1970s, in a decade where there was little room for female writers and directors, very often the male experience was privileged over the females. Another example of this is the film Revenge for a Rape in 1976, in which a woman is raped and her husband basically spends the film chasing down the perpetrators. Again, obviously rather hammy and corny, but you might at least think is pursuing this idea of justice to some extent. However, you'd be wrong, because at the end of the film, it turns out that the man that is shot has actually been misidentified by the rape victim here. So what we have instead is this idea that revenge for a rape, as well as kind of pushing the woman in the film to the background and focusing on her husband, also suggests that women's testimony is unreliable and untrustworthy. The male gaze, where female stories are focalised through the perspective of male writers and directors, has been a long-standing problem when it comes to dramatising these rape storylines. However, rape, used more generally as a plot device by both female and male directors and writers, often subordinates the female experience and remains a problem today. And in fact, these stories that are often meant to be quite cathartic and powerful, I think, often really kind of miss the mark. Which brings me to Downton Abbey. So there's Anna on the left. Now, this isn't a show that I watch regularly, I hasten to add. It's something I occasionally dipped into. And one evening I dipped in to find Anna here, who one of the maids, and she'd been brutally raped by Mr. Green, or Gilligan's valet. The Daily Mirror described it as the equal of Murder on Teletubbies, which may sound over the top, but the point was that the storyline wasn't adapted to suit the sensibilities of an audience that were more comfortable and used to watching storylines about, say, cataract operations, which is the picture below from series 1. The week that saw Anna assaulted saw the show lose almost 1 million viewers that were unhappy with the shocking portrayal of sexual violence. So why include it? Well, arguably one reason is that the writers responded to criticism that the show had faced earlier for increasingly dull plot lines, again, cataracts. But this idea that rape can be used, I think, as a plot device comes in when traumatic subject matter is used for dramatic purposes. And we see this in popular culture frequently. Primetime soap operas, for instance, EastEnders, Brookside, Emmerdale, Coronation Street, they have all employed rape storylines. Yet what now feels unusual is that rape storylines are no longer the preserve of primetime soap. They've been very much prevalent in TV drama in general. So I've got a few examples here: Happy Valley, The Fall, Peaky Blinders, Game of Thrones, etc. Downton, it would seem, is the rule rather than the exception. So as Knightley suggests, it does seem to kind of imply that female stories, if you like, have kind of become haunted by stories of sexual assault and abuse. Even if we accept that some of these stories are told sensitively and carefully and not just as plot devices, I do think there's something troubling and limiting about defaulting to rape narratives to convey something profound about the female experience. Outside of revenge, rape is often used to justify why a female character is hardened or brawny, as if it's almost impossible to imagine that a woman might be emboldened or independent if she hasn't been sort of sexually assaulted. So a couple of examples here. We have Michelle Dockery here, who plays the jaded and thick-skinned Alice Fletcher in Godless. It's not enough for her just to be an independent ranch owner, etc. Her chilliness has to be justified by a history of abuse. Equally aggressive, uncooperative, or intractable female characters are often given the same treatment, such as Lisbeth Salander in the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo films, or Beatrix Kiddo in Kill Bill. In contrast, male heroes and protagonists who share these personality traits don't need sexual assault to often justify their behaviour. So the psyches of characters like James Bond, Bruce Wayne, Han Solo, Walter White are explained by the death of their parents, for instance, or career frustrations. They might be motivated by betrayal, like in Jason Bourne, or loads of other things, but very often sexual assault is not one of them. So it's not just that I think rape is a plot device, but rape as a catch-all explanation for female motivation and backstory does seem to dominate our screens. That's not to say there isn't room for such storylines for women, but I do think there is room for a larger breadth of female characters and a variety of backstories and motivations for them. So if there is room for these storylines, how can they be managed? Do they always have to be controversial and exploitative, or can they say something meaningful and sensitive? Well, I would suggest it depends on the betrayal. If we return to the 1970s one last time, to the film Straw Dogs, this is one of the infamous examples where the portrayal of rape in a film, even at the time, was considered controversial. Without giving you all the details, it tells the story of a couple who moved to Cornwall and are basically hounded and ostracised and eventually attacked by the locals. in general, the film's violence was met, even at the time, with real disgust. So one critic argued, you can see here, that people who are sensitive to both the sight and the implications of violence will probably be disgusted and angered by Straw Dogs because there is no credible motivation for the violence. In other words, it's just for sensationalism and it's gratuitous. However, the thing that almost serves as the film's centerpiece, rather disturbingly, is actually a 4-minute rape scene, which totally and utterly privileges the male attacker's perspective over the victim. Even worse, after some time, the actual victim here, Amy, is shown to kind of give in to her desires and even kisses and holds her attacker. So the rape is sensationalized and glamorized, and she's also shown to be kind of capitulating to her own desires, implying the age-old myth that women who say no really mean yes, which of course is a very disturbing falsehood peddled by popular culture for a very long time. So have things changed? Are our kind of presentation of rape storylines better today? Well, I'd like to think we have come a long way from Straw Dogs, but I think there are arguments to suggest that we need to come further. So a couple of examples here. So if we go to Game of Thrones quickly, the slide, obviously the picture on the left here shows Jaime and Cersei. And in the book by George R.R. Martin, the scene between them where they have sex as she grieves for their dead son had been consensual. But in the dramatised version, a weeping Cersei says no and tries to push her brother off. The episode's director, Alex Graves, shrugged off the criticism, and when he was asked if it constituted rape, he said yes and no. There are moments when she gives in and moments where she pushes him away. It's rather typical of an attitude taken by filmmakers that if the plot serves, if rape serves to further the plot in some way, so in this way it's stressed the ruthlessness of Jaime's character, then anything goes. Sexual violence is justifiable as a plot device. So too, Daenerys in series 1 is sold to Khal Drogo, who then rapes her, but troublingly, she ends up falling in love with him. Subsequent episodes try to portray Daenerys asserting her power over Drogo, we assume to suggest a kind of balancing of the books, but for me at least, this did very little to undercut the first myth the series perpetuated, that sexual abuse can be the prerequisite for a passionate relationship. For me, these two examples, considered in the wider context of female nudity in the series, and yes, there is male nudity, but at the start, very much focuses on women's bodies. I think it is hard to argue the series doesn't participate in the perpetuation of rape culture. In this way, if we return to Anna, we could say on a superficial level, Downton at least marked Anna out as a very, very clear victim. She's a far cry, for instance, from Amy in Straw Dogs. The brutality of her rape meant that it was very obvious that she was the victim, and the rape wasn't in any way prettified or shown to be sort of titillating. It was revealed as a very humiliating experience. However, I'd suggest another kind of rape myth comes into play here, one from an older narrative, and that's of the helpless woman undone by an evil Lothario. Such a myth does little to further our understanding of what rape is, not only its definition, but its various circumstantial and environmental contexts. In other words, Downton did what it does best, which is to present things in black and white. Nuance and complexity have never really been at the top of Julian Fellowes' agenda with this series. So in real life, rape cases, I think, are far more complex and less excessively violent than this one. Many victims don't suffer such obvious afflictions, but they've still experienced rape. However, the lack of physical scars and sometimes problematic nature of the relationships between attacker and victim have historically complicated our understanding of what rape is. And although we all know that in the 21st century, there are comprehensive attempts to make the definition of rape clear-cut, the circumstances surrounding it can prove opaque, muddying our understanding of what it is and isn't. Whilst Downton didn't prettify Anna's rape, it did present it as transparent and didn't explore some of the more complex, seemingly insipid contexts in which it can occur. And to help people understand what rape is, that its definition is not ambiguous or nebulous, even though the circumstances may seem to suggest this, I'd say that popular culture needs to refrain from repeating basic rape myths. Instead, television needs to dramatise the complexities that surround its definition in an attempt to demystify them and challenge them. But perhaps by focusing on what Downton didn't do here is a bit unfair. The show did at least privilege Anna's experience over Green's, guarding against the old trap where the victim's perspective is kind of subjugated at the expense of the rapist. However, when taken with another rape plotline, it seems that Downton was at least clumsy, I think, in its treatment of rape storylines. And the other rape plot I refers to Lady Mary, who's pictured here, and her sexual assault by Kamal Pumak in series 1. This wasn't supposed to be portrayed as a rape. However, it was. In the scene, Mary repeatedly says no, as Pumak continues, ignoring her, telling him to get off her. He also sneaks into her room when she doesn't want him to in the middle of the night. This kind of assault is actually far more common than many people think. So a woman who is initially attracted to her attacker, she was earlier in the evening in the episode, then actually ends up taking responsibility because she feels she's led him on. Mary never sees this as assault, but she does feel guilty afterwards. In this scene, there's no screaming as he continues to force himself on her, and there's no examples of obvious violence. However, Mary does not give her consent. That's very clear. So this was not a rape storyline, and yet it was. The problem was that Downton didn't interpret it as such, and neither did many viewers. More troublingly, again, there are many hints that Mary begins to enjoy herself. So we come full circle, back to straw dogs. And again, what I would suggest is that the real problem is in all of these cases is that by not presenting non-consensual sex as rape, writers and directors participate in writing myths that serve to legitimise rape and prevent it from becoming clearly understood and defined. I don't have that much time. Let me have a quick look. So really quickly, Poldark was one of the other examples that I looked at. If anyone did watch Poldark, the BBC's retelling of the book, which was first serialised in the 70s, the BBC basically raised Poldark to these unassailable kind of heights of hero. That was until he arguably raped the love of his life, Elizabeth. The direction participated in much the kind of romanticised depiction of rape that anti-rape activists are trying to debunk. Elizabeth said no, but Ross continued. Poldark continued, eventually forcing himself on her until, as direction would have us believe, she succumbed to her desires. And again, it didn't seem to really fit the narrative. It suggested again that kind of protests are merely a form of foreplay and should, and rightly so, be ignored. However, unlike Downton, viewers were more aware, maybe this was a year or two on, more aware of the fact that there was something troubling about this presentation. However, again, it was dismissed. Aidan Turner himself described it as something that it just seemed right, and that to construe what happened as rape was simply to misconstrue the text. So how do we get around this? Can rape storylines ever really convey the trauma of sexual violence in an honest and truthful way? Some believe it is impossible, and therefore we should stop doing it. So Doone McKeegan said here, she's a writer and director, she said, I'm getting really angry about what I'm watching on television. Can we stop seeing women pulled down the stairs by their hair, followed, raped? Can we just stop, even for a year? I'd say that rape as a subject for drama more or less guarantees controversy, and it's as if we signal our disapproval of the act itself by heaping our disapproval on its fictional depiction, a little bit like I've been doing today, really. But in this way, I'd say that we reach a dead end. Because if we stop telling these stories altogether, we risk becoming complicit with those who pretend that violence towards women doesn't happen. It might be hard to portray it in a fair, sensitive, and kind of, I suppose, accurate way, but equally, surely it's important to keep trying to do this. And some more recent shows, I'd say, have been more successful. So these are my examples. Apple Tree Yard on the right here, this fared quite well, and rather than perpetuating myths, seemed to debunk them. So in Apple Tree Yard, a woman who is married accepts a lift home from a colleague and they stop at an office and she's raped. But in this series, the female perspective is exclusively privileged, both during and after the attack. More so, the series focuses on the aftermath, why Yvonne doesn't report it. Reasons such as fear of being disbelieved, the impact on her son and her family, etc. So the victim's experience and the impact of her trauma is at the heart of the narrative. This is also the case for Netflix's series Unbelievable, which aired, I think it was last year. The series, which features women in all the lead roles, is based on a real-life case of a vulnerable young woman raped by an intruder who, faced with the scepticism of investigating police, later withdraws her statement. There are glimpses of the attack, but these are seen through the victim's eyes. And Unbelievable dwells more on the assaults that come later. So the kind of horrific internal examinations this girl has to experience, the pitiless questioning in the hours following the rape. She has to repeat her story 6 times. And of course, the judgment and the victim blaming. It's quite rare, I think, and heartening to find series that look with such nuance and compassion at the effects of sexual violence on victims. And both of these shows, rather than reducing its audience to mere voyeurs, actually dig deeply into themes about trauma and self-worth and the failures of the justice system. So it shows us that there's no single reaction to rape among victims as well. Some suffer lapses of memory, whereas others remember every detail. Some weep and others appear disassociated and even serene. As a series, it succeeds, in my opinion, in demystifying myths rather than promoting them. So, because I'm very aware of time, I'm going to pause there, but I'll just conclude by saying that this talk isn't supposed to be an injunction against rape as drama. I don't think that rape storylines should not be written and presented. However, I would suggest it would be encouraging to see more female-centered roles and complex characterizations that don't depend on assault and rape as the only justification for a female backstory. So too, rape stories themselves are very important. And if you allow any subject to become unspeakable in art, then you abandon that subject to those who would pretend it doesn't happen, or if it does happen, it isn't that bad. But how this is done is everything. Any drama where the viewer is left gawping at the female body, complicit in its objectification, have no place. Rather, I would say that the victim's perspective must always be privileged so that rape myths can be debunked and not endorsed. This, as the examples I've referred to show, I don't think is a particularly easy task. However, it can be done, and if it's going to be done, then it needs to be done right. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting, and your points were so compelling. I could listen all day. We don't have time for questions, but I'm sure we would both be happy to carry on this conversation if pupils have any in future. So thank you so much. Our next talk is on Wednesday at 1 o'clock. Please have a look at the classroom post for details. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.